if you go into a house or a kitchen and it's black and white and pink, you know how old it is, right? And then you might remember turquoise and avocado and harvest gold, the short, unfortunate poppy red, black, almond, white, stainless steel, black again, stainless steel again. You know, we can go into a house and we can see exactly how old it is. No one ever asked me what happened to the avocado people. You know who you are. But we get asked all the time, whatever happened to the Clovis people? The short answer is there's no such thing. There's Clovis technology, but we have very little idea what people or peoples used it. All the people we're going to be talking about today in the New World are modern humans, Homo sapiens, just like you and I. Collectively, they're not any dumber or more primitive than all of us here. We tend to portray them as kind of short, hairy, ape-like people, but they're just like us. Current scientific data points to modern humans' origins in Africa, followed by outmigration. Humans were thought to have gotten to Europe about 50,000 years ago, for instance. That is until the publication of data from Epidemic Cave in Greece, with the oldest modern human dates outside Africa now 210,000 years ago. This stuff changes pretty rapidly. So archaeologists talk in terms of hypotheses, ideas. Rarely do we talk in terms of fact when we're talking about these ideas of how people moved around, because it can change pretty rapidly. We have often pointedly repeated that archaeological evidence is incremental based on the current data, and our hypotheses, the ideas of what occurred in the past, change as that new data is found. Our story of the peopling of the Americas starts with a Jesuit priest, Jose de Acosta, in 1590. Jose had spent 15 years in the New World in South and Central America, and he wrote about his experiences in a book I pictured here, The Natural and Moral History of the Indies. Believe me, it's a real page turner. The book became the bestseller of the day, though, and it was translated and printed widely. And in it, he speculated on where the people in the New World had come from. Now, first, he knew as a Jesuit priest that all humans were descended from Noah and his family in Central Asia, so they must have come here from there. And he looked at whether they'd come by land or sea and decided that the people he saw in the New World were way too primitive. He cited their lack of the compass. That was primitive for him. And so they couldn't have come by boat. He also noted that the New World had old world animals like wolves, and since only an idiot would put a wolf in his boat, he decided that humans and animals must have walked here somehow. So in 1614, Edward Brerewood wrote a book. Edward Brerewood was basically an early linguist interested in languages, and his work kind of reinforced this idea. His book was actually posthumously published by his son, but it was still being quoted up to a century later. A number of popular writers had been tossing out the idea that Native Americans were descended of the lost tribes of Israel, and Brerewood's work discounted this notion. He thought they were more likely related to the Tartars of Crimea, making them of Asian ancestry. So people thought, well, he thought that out pretty reasonably. That was a good argument. So, okay, they probably walked here from Asia. And that takes us to this guy, Thomas Jefferson, who's often regarded as the father of American archaeology. In the 1780s, in response to a questionnaire from France, he wrote a book about North America, Notes on the State of Virginia. And one of the things he did was scientifically excavate a burial mound near his home, and he recorded the various layers he discovered. He also speculated on the origin of inhabitants of America. He concluded that, one, there was really no problem with people getting here by boat. Two, there was probably little or no distance between the continents of Asia and North America. They didn't know that for sure yet, but he thought so. And at three, there was a resemblance between Native Americans and those in Northeast Asia, which a study of language might clarify. So basically, he thought here, people walked here from Asia, though he wouldn't discount boats. By the 19th century, we'd pretty much decided that modern humans came from somewhere else, and Asia looked like the best bet. We still had two big questions to resolve. When did people get here? And how? By what route did they get here? And there were a number of false starts. Dr. Charles Abbott was a medical doctor and a naturalist who took up archaeology on his farm in Trenton, New Jersey. He was impressed by the early stone tools coming out of gravels in France and was convinced he had the same thing in the river gravels of the Delaware Valley. William Henry Holmes of the Smithsonian basically ripped his head off by saying he was equating primitive with old, which is a problem we still see today. I get pictures of chipped pieces of chert from all over Texas, and I think many of you have probably been offered that by one of your neighbors and say, well, obviously it must be really old because it's really primitive. And they don't necessarily equate. But the head of the Peabody Museum at Harvard was intrigued enough to send out an archaeologist, Ernest Volks, who worked with Abbott for 20 years. He basically concluded that the tools he was finding were not as old as Abbott thought they were. A lot of the early archaeologists in Texas and vocational archaeologists in Texas were basically doing it out of patriotism. They figured if Europe had this stuff, then we must have even better. I mean, Thomas Jefferson had sent Lewis and Clark out looking for mammoths because he knew that they'd found mammoth bones in Europe, and he figured they were probably still alive in North America and he could trump them with that. So Holmes wasn't exactly alone in his attitude towards researchers, professional or amateur. His colleague at the Smithsonian, Dr. Alisher Leakey, often attacked any idea that man in the New World was older than 4,000 years. This quote here is actually from an official biography of him, and I would say it's by one of his friends. And he said he steadfastly clung to and passionately fought for this conclusion to the end of his life, even in view of evidence demanding a reconsideration. So this is, if this is what your friends say about you, they're saying you're really stubborn and you were probably wrong, but I like the guy anyways. And not that Hrdlicka wasn't always justified. Early archaeology in the Americas wasn't always a scientific pursuit, and many researchers jumped to conclusions like Abbott. For example, from 1964 to 1970, Louis Leakey got involved in his only excavation in the Americas, in the Calico Mountains of California. He thought that many of the stones he was seeing there were artifacts similar to those he'd seen in Africa, and that they were occurring in geological strata older than 200,000 years. It was a high energy environment with thousands of rocks, and he picked some of those out that he thought looked like tools. His wife, Mary, wrote in her biography that his involvement was, quote, catastrophic to his professional career and was largely responsible for the parting of our ways. So here's one way that archaeologists. In 1927, oops, here we go, come on. Computer just stopped there, there we go. In 1927, Frank Hibben from the Denver Museum found stone projectile points in association with bison, known to have become extinct by 10,000 years ago, near Folsom, New Mexico. He left them in situ, in place, and had other researchers come and take a look. They agreed that the find was scientifically valid. And by the way, you can see the original Folsom Point and bison ribs there in Denver because they took it out as a block, and it's now in the museum there. Later, Edgar Howard, working at Blackwater Draw near Clovis, New Mexico, found what he called, quote, cruder projectile points with the remains of mammoth, horse, and bison. Blackwater Draw is the type site for the Clovis culture, which was determined to be older than Folsom. I'm not sure that I agree with cruder, having looked at an awful lot of Clovis points, but that's what he thought. And in 1936, Junius Bird, working in southern Chile, found what are now called fishtail points in association with extinct horse. I want to emphasize that fishtail points are similar in age to the Clovis culture in the north. There was now no doubt that people were in the New World prior to 10,000 years ago. So how did people get here? Well, based on all those earlier writings, it was assumed they came from Asia. In 1741, Vitus Bering had established that Asia and North America were divided by a narrow strait. In 1933, W.A. Johnston came up with the idea, later called the ice-free corridor, that there was a gap between ice sheets. And in 1937, the existence of a continent, Beringia, between Asia and North America was proposed. We put that all together with assumptions that have been around since Acosta's work in 1590 and came up with this story, a hypothesis regarding the peopling of the Americas. And this is the story we all learned in school, and unfortunately we still teach to fourth graders here in Texas. 13,500 years ago, there were these half-naked men running around Siberia. I like to use these two pictures. The one on your left is actually from a Russian publication, and they always portray him somewhat Vladimir Putin-esque, a big guy, bare-chested, staring off at the west menacingly, I guess. The one on the right is actually from an American publication, as I noted before, we always portray him kind of hunched over, really hairy, somewhat ape-like. They're all modern human beings, so in this case, the Russians are probably a little closer to the truth. But we said 13,500 years ago, there were these people there because that was the oldest dates we'd found for the Clovis culture. So we assumed that that represented these first peoples in the Americas. There's a lot of circular reasoning involved in this hypothesis. We had to give them a reason for moving around. So we decided they're chasing mammoths. They're highly mobile mammoth hunters, right? So there's my mammoth herd. We always depict them as 10 to 15 half-naked guys poking a mammoth, right? And one day they arrived at a bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska, a land bridge. This is my land bridge right there. And they must have crossed it following the mammoths. And they arrived at the edge of the great glaciers. The Cordilleran Glacier, which went from the mountains to the sea, and the Laurentian Glacier, which covered 5 million square miles of northern North America, up to 3 miles high in places. This is one artist's depiction of what the face of that glacier would have looked like. Apparently, they came at just the right moment. When I was in school, they kind of skipped over this part, but I have a good imagination. So, behold, an ice-free corridor. And the two glaciers parted, leaving a 2,000-mile-long passageway, an ice-free corridor between them. So our early immigrants head down through this narrow corridor, probably not in car convoys, but they're not the heroes of the story. They're an Asian biker gang, and they kill everything they come across until 37 large animal species become extinct. This is pretty much the typical depiction, but you have to remember, these are modern humans like yourself, so I imagine the usual situation would be somewhat closer to this one than the last one. So this story, this hypothesis, sounds a bit silly when I tell it that way, doesn't it? I show a couple of funny pictures, I throw Charlton Heston in it, and you say, well, that's pretty silly. But with the exception of Charlton Heston, that's exactly the story we all learned. Okay, so let's start over. Siberia is one of the coldest places on Earth, so no half-naked men. They're not all men, but instead they're babies, teenagers, adults, and grandma. They're not chasing mammoths. We only have 17 mammoth kill sites in the Americas, and mammoths don't really migrate east-west. There's no land bridge. Instead, there's a continent 1,600 miles wide called Beringia. A gap between two melting ice sheets would have a river, then lakes, then swamps, and eventually some dry ground. And finally, we only have evidence for humans killing about 7 of the 37 extinct large animal species. My personal favorite is this one, the teratorn. The teratorn is a carnivorous bird. It kills what it eats, and it has a 24-foot wingspan. So think Cessna, and you are all Slim Jims. So yeah, some kind of Asian biker gang with a primitive anti-aircraft weapon came to North America and killed all the teratorns, apparently. It just doesn't make any sense. And there was actually no archaeological or geological evidence for this hypothesis. But to some, it quickly became almost a religion. Harold Gladwin, a prominent Southwestern archaeologist who proposed a 25,000-year-old migration, wrote this quote out of frustration. All the lights in the house of the high priests of American archaeology are out. All the doors and windows are shut and securely fastened. They do not sleep with their windows open for fear a new idea might fly in. We have rung the bell of reason. We have banged on the door with logic. We have thrown the gravel of evidence against their windows. But the only sign of life in the house is an occasional snore of dogma. And this is 1947 that he wrote this. In 1964, Dr. Alex Krieger published a list of sites he thought dated to at least 25,000 years ago in a volume titled Prehistoric Man in the New World. He listed 23 sites in North America and 25 in South America. Then in the 1970s, researchers found the site of Monteverde near Puerto Montt, Chile, about as far south as you can get in southern Chile, which most archaeologists agree dates to at least 14,800 years ago, or 1,000 years before the old hypothesis said people walked here. The first peoples in the Americas could not possibly have walked here. The way was blocked. So they had to come along the Atlantic, Pacific, or both coasts. As an interesting side note, Alice Schudlitzka published an article in 1933 where he said that the earliest immigrants, quote, must have been parties of people well acquainted with and provided for coastal navigation, for their movements as well as their main livelihood in Asia depended on such navigation. They doubtless had small or individual as well as large or group skin boats. The idea that Clovis is representative of the first peoples in the New World is dead. It is truly dead. Nevertheless, there's still a small number of people trying to make it work, and we call this the Clovis first hypothesis. If anybody doesn't get the joke here, the picture is actually of King Clovis, the Merovingian king that adopted Christianity in Spain, or in France rather, and this was in every child's catechism early on, and where Clovis, New Mexico got its name from. This whole hypothesis never made much sense in the past, nor did it fit the data. And remember the fishtail culture in South America with the same dates as Clovis? If Clovis represented the first peoples in the Americas, then who the heck was in South America at the exact same time? There had to have been a precursor. Other sites were found that bolster the story of Monteverde. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter was actually identified by the landowner, Albert Miller, in 1955, but it wasn't until 1973 that Dr. James Ottavasio began working there. Excuse me there. He painstakingly excavated the cave with razor blades. That's how they scraped the ground, and found hearths and tools near the bottom dating to almost 19,000 years ago. Two separate crews under Joseph McAvoy and Mike Johnson worked at Cactus Hill in Virginia, starting in 1983. They identified a Clovis strata overlaying an older strata 18 to 20,000 years old, with projectile points similar to the Miller points found in the oldest strata of Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. The Paisley 5 Mile Point Caves in Western Oregon were first studied by Luther Cressman in 1930s, who identified human tools with Pleistocene animals. Dennis Jenkins of the University of Oregon went back in 2002 to confirm that association and found that not only was Cressman correct, but there were lower strata with human tools and coprolites. If you don't know what coprolites are, we have to have a scientific word for everything. So they're turds. And you can argue about a stone tool till you're blue in the face, but a turd's a turd. It's organic, so you can get a good date from it, and you can pull DNA from it as well. Humans were using these caves as toilets 14,300 years ago, south of the glaciers. The Schaefer Mammoth site near Kenosha, Wisconsin was discovered in 1964 when a backhoe driver installing drain tile excavated through the middle of a mammoth kill site. The site was excavated, started in 1992, and while Dan Joyce was working there, another mammoth was found on the Hebier farm, less than a mile down the road and within sight of the Schaefer farm. I was there a couple of years ago, and you can clearly see one from the other. 80% of the Schaefer mammoth was intact. 90% of the Hebier mammoths, which is the mounted specimen there in the Milwaukee Museum now, both had a few stone tools associated with them, but more importantly, there were cut marks on the mammoth bones. And dates from the mammoths came back predating the Clovis culture. In June of this last year, Cyprian Argeline announced finding tools in Chiquihuite Cave in Zacatecas, Mexico, that dated back as far as 26,500 years ago. I feel obligated to mention that Cyprian worked at the Gault site years ago, and Mike Collins convinced him to quit looking at the ancient Maya and start looking for something really old. So we're very proud of Cyprian's find there. So that's the big picture of the people in the Americas. But let's turn to a more important place, right? Texas, and what's happening here. James Edwin Pierce is credited with being the first professional archaeologist in Texas. Pierce's family had moved to Texas from North Carolina in the 1870s. He got a master's from UT in 1895. And from 1895 to 1917, he was the principal of the Austin High School. And he used leaves of absence to study archaeology and anthropology at the University of Chicago and the Sorbonne in Paris. And in 1917, he became chairman of the Department of Institutional History at UT and changed its name to the Department of Anthropology. Pierce began an archaeological survey of the state in the 1920s, and he believed that there was an older culture here than previously recognized that he thought might have been, quote, migratory big game hunters. Because apparently that's the knee-jerk reaction for archaeologists. When in doubt, they're migratory big game hunters. In 1911, a recently graduated osteopathic surgeon named Cyrus Ray moved to Texas from Louisiana, set up practice in Abilene. Cyrus was described as a big, aggressive man who pursued every endeavor all out. He was president of the State Association of Osteopathic Physicians and Surgeons. He served on the State Board of Medical Examiners. He wrote booklets and articles on a wide range of topics, not just medical research, but hygiene, botany, ceramics, gardening, mineralogy. Ray became an early convert to archaeology, and in 1927 began a systematic search of the Abilene area for signs of prehistoric peoples. In 1928, he founded the society that became the Texas Archaeological Society today. Ray was among the first to find Clovis projectile points and sites in Texas, though the Clovis culture was not defined until the 1940s. So he found this stuff, brought it to people's attention, and they kind of went, yeah, we don't know what that is. Dr. E.H. Sellards became the second director of the Texas Memorial Museum, which had been started by J.E. Pierce. He was also the director for the Bureau of Economic Geology, the oldest established research unit at UT. Sellards was interested in both vertebrate fossils and early human prehistory. Glenn Evans came on board as his assistant and later associate director of the Texas Memorial Museum, was also a geologist at the BEG. Glenn is today known as the Dean of Texas Paleontology and the father of geoarchaeology. Between the two of them, starting with excavations in 1934, uncovering mammoth and stone tools near Miami, Texas, they established the antiquity of man in Texas. They went on to work at Buckner Ranch, Plainview, Lubbock Lake, and the Midland site on the massive Charbroil Ranch, where Glenn Evans took under his wing a local teenager named Michael B. Collins. He still gets upset when I show this picture of him with the bandoliers and barefoot, but there's Mike. Mike was interested in archaeology. At the age of 12, he asked to start an archaeology club at his school. He was told by the principal that they couldn't start a club because archaeology wasn't a science. So he and his friends founded the Midland Archaeological Society, which still exists today. At 19, he became the youngest director in the history of the Texas Archaeological Society. He went on to UT and the University of Arizona, where he got a PhD specializing in geoarchaeology. Mike then taught at the University of Kentucky for a number of years before returning to his native Texas and the Texas Archaeological Research Lab. In 1991, Mike Collins and Tom Hester made their first visit to the Gault site, which is located 40 miles north of Austin, just outside the central Texas town of Florence. There's a good aerial view of the Gault site. It had been known to collectors since at least 1904 and professionals since 1929. The site was subject to both looting and collecting for almost 90 years. The site is remarkable for the surprises it had for the archaeologists. One of the first was stones like this one with incised designs on them. Hand size and smaller, the stones that were found in the deepest layers of the site are the oldest dated art in the Americas. This one isn't very large. If you've forgotten your metric, now most of you should know that working in archaeology, but if you've forgotten, we tell people who work on our sites that if they put an English measurement on one of our forms, we will beat them within 2.54 centimeters of their life. So there you go. That's about 2 inches. We now actually have more than 160 of them in the lab, most with geometrical patterns like these. Stones like these are found on every continent except Antarctica, going back as far as 450,000 years ago to pre-human hominids. Many of the designs are actually part of the software of your frontal cortex. They're actually how we store and sort memories. Children about the age of 2 start drawing them unaided. Our next surprise was the sheer quantity of archaeological material at Gault. Over 10 years, the Gault School excavated approximately 3% of the site and brought 2.6 million artifacts back to the lab to study. So a lot of that was debris debitage from what was apparently a large-scale tool manufacturing operation. We got a further surprise when we came upon the lower mandible of a juvenile female Columbian mammoth, which would have been a nice find in itself, but it was surrounded by 22 stone butchering tools and a Clovis point. This makes it a probable mammoth kill site, one of only 17 currently known in the Americas. Test excavations in another part of the site came across a slightly rectangular stone floor. Now, that's not surprising if you don't want to go to sleep and wake up soaking wet with the moisture that wicks up through central Texas clay. But this floor is surrounded by a non-random scatter of artifacts, including a flint knapping area to the north where someone was manufacturing and resharpening stone tools, an area filled with burned flakes indicating a fire somewhat to the east of it, and an area to the southwest where we found quite a bit of animal bone, their garbage. This data, among other things, indicates that this floor has a front and a back, and therefore a structure on top of it. The tool technology and dates tells us this is at least 13,500 years old and perhaps older, making this the oldest excavated house in North America. The last surprise was a big one. In 2002, we were winding up excavations and leaving the site for a while. And one of the staff, Sam Gardner, pictured here, was cleaning a profile following the water table as it dropped. He'd dig until he hit the water. You can see it at the bottom there, wait a couple of days, dig lower. In fact, it would not have been possible for us to dig at Gault if it wasn't for the fact that we had a major drought starting at that time. At the very bottom of this test unit, he ran into Clovis Age artifacts, those things above the line in the picture to the left, and you can see the dates over on the right. Those we thought represented the first peoples of the Americas. So those are 13,500 to 12,700 years old, but below the Clovis artifacts, he kept finding more evidence, stone tools and debris that predated Clovis. So in 2007, after acquiring the site and donating it to the Archaeological Conservancy, we excavated some quick holes to show visiting archaeologists the geology of the site. The largest gathering of archaeologists in the Americas, the Society for American Archaeology annual meeting, was in Austin for the first time ever. I can tell you from sad experience that 5,000 archaeologists on 6th Street is not a good idea, but we were going to run buses up to the site to just show people what the geology of the site looked like. We again found artifacts, some almost 3 feet below the Clovis strata. After the archaeologists left, we raised a large stress skin building over the area and began to remove the mixed surface soils. I'm responsible for logistics, and I had a narrow window to get this building up, and they couldn't use a bobcat to get rid of the beer cans and cigarette wrappers. So they gave me a pick and a shovel and a wheelbarrow, and my staff says this is one of the few pictures of me actually working. I didn't get very far when we found out that very little of this area had actually been dug or looted. Basically, just where I started working had cigarette wrappers and beer cans. The rest of it was all intact. We excavated a 56 square meter unit designed to step down twice to eventually expose 12 square meters of the underlying bedrock to see what was going on there. The stone circles you see, the one in the near left here in the center of the picture, are 4,000 and 8,000 year old burned rock ovens in the midden. Cursed their inefficiency. The looters and collectors had never worked in this area. And I say curse their inefficiency because, of course, as you all know, I'm interested in the stuff at the very bottom, but I'm responsible for all intact archaeology. And the record was held by the little one by one in the lower left-hand corner of this picture, where they had 16,683 flakes in a 10 centimeter one by one. Every one of those pieces larger than a quarter, we recorded its exact position on Earth with a laser system. We recorded it on our clipboard. We mapped it. We recorded it on another sheet for artifacts removed. We recorded it on a photographic log. We recorded it on a dry erase board. We got a camera and a north arrow, took a picture of it and removed it 16,000 times. It took the 2 young women digging that 4-inch deep one by one, just 10 centimeters deep, 2.5 months to dig it. And I learned new words from them I didn't think they should really know, but they were not happy. But it takes a lot. We finally reached bedrock in 2013. And of course, it's an impressive hole to look at. And even more so if you realize that we do microscopic use-wear analysis on the stone tools. That means we look at the edges on our high-powered microscopes. They tell us what material that was used on and in what direction. That means we could not use steel tools around the stone tools. And as we all know, our favorite tool is a Marshalltown trowel. But since the material these folks are using for their tools, chert, is stronger than steel, and a steel tool would leave a big silver streak on it, this hole was primarily excavated by volunteers and staff using chopsticks and bamboo splinters. Some of you probably helped in doing that. We had more than 2,300 volunteers at the Gault site work on the excavation. This is actually the bedrock at the very bottom. We did indeed find what we were looking for. We found more than 130,000 tools and the debris from making tools that date between 16 and 20,000 years ago. And even the bedrock here has a story to tell. There's a series of grooves here that tell us that at one point this was the outer bend of Buttermilk Creek. It was cutting outward to your upper left, and people were on the point bar, and they were making tools and butchering one of the now extinct horses, in this case, Equus scotti. So I circled, you can see the teeth there that are all together. The mandible is long gone, but the teeth are still there. And Equus scotti was about the size of a modern medium-sized horse. We found remains of these horses in several places at Gault site. The Gault site, which has abundant stone and water resources, as well as readily available foods, was popular throughout time. There are 22 archaeological cultures you can find on a Central Texas site. And we not only have all 22, but a culture even earlier we've not yet named. I've been arguing for years for the Clark culture. I'm not really getting any traction on that. And the good people of Florence are really arguing heavily for the Florence culture. Some of the tools that were left behind by the earliest Texans are very familiar, and some are significantly different, as would be expected of a tool style prior to Clovis. The projectile points in particular are unlike anything we've seen here before. On your left is a typical Clovis point, and on your right are the bases of 3 points found 14 feet underground. And they're not very big, only about 3/4 of an inch long. Whole, they don't be only about an inch long. I know the knee-jerk reaction for many archaeologists are, obviously these are arrowheads, but we have multiple proofs that nothing was moving down through that stratigraphy. These are found exactly where they originally were. And it represents a technology we may not understand. The bow and arrow, as we understand it currently, didn't get here till 1,200 years ago. And they're way too small for dart points, really. So one of these, if you'd like to ever see one, is the very first case in the Bullock State History Museum. And they're becoming Texas exhibit now. They have to start at the beginning, and that's with Gault. Our colleagues like Austin so much, they came back for a return bout in 2014. These are the ones that weren't so hungover from 6th Street the night before that they could come out to the site. We hosted busloads of them out there before we closed up the major excavations. They asked a lot of questions, but they seemed satisfied by what they'd seen. And in July of 2018, we published this article in Science Advances, one of the premier science publications in the world. It details the geology, stratigraphy, and dating of the Gault site, showing that we have human artifacts that are unquestionably 16 to 20,000 years old here in Central Texas. The news was quickly picked up by electronic and print media throughout the United States, then in Great Britain. I mean, my apologies to Bob and Ellen, but they almost speak the same language, so that didn't surprise me. But then articles were found and written in magazines, newspapers, and online throughout the world. In fact, there's more interest and knowledge about the subject outside the US than inside the US. I used to have to spend a lot of time explaining myself when I talk to groups. One of the very first publications that we saw was the leading newspaper in Santiago, Chile. They'd been very upset by the controversy surrounding Monteverde and considered that to be basically racism and North Americans always saying that they know better. So they wrote an article about Gault and Monteverde that you could pretty much sum up with, "I told you so." We're actually finishing up the very last chapter of the monograph on Clovis and older deposits at Gault. It's shortly be on its way to the editors. As the hemisphere-wide search goes on for more evidence of the earliest peoples of the Americas, so does the search here in Texas. We look throughout this hemisphere, but we also try to look at usually 10 to 15 sites here in Texas every year. This last year, even with the pandemic, we looked at 11. One site is an interesting data point, but since archaeologists deal in patterns of human behavior, We need other sites like Gault with similar dating and tools before we see any patterns and we can name that Clark culture. So the Gault School works throughout this hemisphere. We've worked in Chile, Peru, Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, throughout the United States. Sometimes we're working on our own, sometimes we're working in conjunction with other people. We also worked for 5 years with NOAA off of Western Florida on the continental shelf, looking at possibility of underwater sites. So if you'd like to find out more about our work, we actually have an extensive website at gaultschool.org. I will mention, and I know I'm preaching to the choir to many of you, but the Gault School is a nonprofit, and we are dependent on grants, memberships, and donations from people like you who are both interested in what the past can tell us and wish to participate in our discoveries. Our website has more information on how you can join us in the mission and more information on our research to date. So with that, thank you again for inviting me this afternoon, and I believe I have some time for some questions. Okay, if you have any questions, type them into the chat and we'll field them and let you know what we think.
Thank you, Clark.
So far, we've not received any.
Not a single question. You guys know this all by heart now. Come on, I know there's somebody's out there who's going to break the ice.
Well, Clark, I'll start. When you say you've got examples of all 23,
22, yeah.
22, would you consider them lithic traditions? Lithic traditions as IDs?
Yeah, for the most part, we're looking at lithic traditions.
Okay.
You know, and sometimes they use those interchangeably with cultures, but they really aren't.
Right. Yeah. From what I understand, Folsom is very underrepresented within the assemblage.
Yeah, the people using Folsom technology really like their bison.
Thank you for that.
The period there was one that Texas was getting moister, so you had more grass, you know, and when you get in wetter years, the grass would go all the way down into the plains in Tamaulipas, and you'd get bison all the way down there. So if you really like your bison, they aren't up on the Balcones, they aren't up on the Edwards Plateau, they're down in the coastal plains. So it looks like people using Folsom technology stopped by Gault to retool, but didn't spend as much time as other people did there.
Okay.
Yeah, they kind of passed through really quickly.
Clark, can you hear me?
Yeah.
People, if they want to do a chat, you have to use the drop-down menu from the top of your screen.
I see a question there. How do the Clovis first folks defend their position? Boy, that's a question we're all still asking, because the attempts I've seen have been pretty silly. One of the ones that's my favorite was that, well, these people were coming down and they were following migratory birds through an ice-free corridor. Now, mind you, we don't have any evidence for either plants or animals in the ice-free corridor until 12,500 years ago so far. So 1,000 years after we said people came through. But the guys who were talking about the migratory birds were using the Texas Parks and Wildlife map of geese migrations. Oddly enough, none of them are from Texas, but that's the map they used. And all of those migrations would end up on top of those glaciers. And the geese weren't going up there to sit on an ice cube. So the migrations in the past would have been to south of the glaciers, not north of them, where you have the melt lakes and the plentiful food and everything else. So, I mean, some of the evidence is so flimsy, it's amazing. And one of the leading Clovis firsters actually was at a conference we hosted in Austin. And in response to some of the questions from other people, he said, now I'm not saying there wasn't somebody here. There just weren't a lot of them. And everybody went, wait. You can't say there was nobody here and then say, well, maybe there were a few. It doesn't matter how many. The first peoples got here earlier. Yeah, so the relations are really, the things that people are defending this with are really silly. For any of you who like Jared Diamond's writing, I every once in a while, I get a teacher that asks me, should I use Jared Diamond's book in my class? And I say, oh God, no. Because while he was gifted with a remarkable writing ability, they're very readable, the archaeological information is horrific. And Jared Diamond wrote a wonderful editorial that was published in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago that says there is no such thing as pre-Clovis, because if there was, we would have found it by now. I had to note to the editor of the Wall Street Journal that William Clark of Lewis and Clark found Clovis points at Big Bone Lick in 1806. They're in a museum in Cincinnati. But we didn't define the Clovis culture till 1940 something. So the fact is pre-Clovis may be all around us until we find a context. We won't know. It was a dumb argument, just horrific. So let's see. Any ideas on if or how the small points were hafted? Wow. No, they don't really show signs of haftware, which actually isn't that surprising. Not everything does. Haftware kind of comes about if they're loosening up in the haft and they start to wiggle. If they weren't on a haft for very long, they wouldn't show haftware. So that doesn't tell us much. And the thing that would tell me the most would be the points themselves, the very tip. We can actually use fracture mechanics and a little bit of math and tell you how fast they were moving when they broke. But I need the points for that, and I do not have the tips of those. I just have bases. Oh, I get one question. What are your thoughts on the coal seam contamination issue relating to carbon-14 dating reliability at Meadowcroft Rock Shelter? This is why Jim out of Osseo doesn't talk about this publicly anymore, because every time somebody said you needed to do something else, he'd do it, and then they'd come up with another excuse. There are no coal seams near Meadowcroft Rock Shelter. Multiple tests of the groundwater there have shown no contamination from older carbons. So again, it's a bad argument. People keep throwing it up because everyone knows that Pennsylvania has coal mines, right? They're actually on the other side of Pennsylvania, but that's okay. So that's one of those arguments that makes it sounds almost reasonable, but it really isn't. Is the assumption that all pre-Clovis is one culture? No. In fact, we're not sure if we're looking at one culture or multiple cultures in the tools we've gotten from Gault, because we don't have good enough context to be able to tell that. We have stuff that comes out of a meter of dirt below Clovis, some from near the top of that, some from the bottom of that. We may have multiple previous occupations at Gault. We need more tools, more dates, other sites to put that in context. And I would assume there are probably multiple cultures before Clovis as well. How do you compare and contrast the work at Gault with Mike Waters' work nearby? Well, first of all, I have to say that A, Mike Waters and his crew worked at Gault for 2 years first. And B, the site they call Debrel Friedkin is the lower edge of Gault. So they're still working at Gault. They just don't like to say that. It's also, if you look at their publications, not near Florence, it's near Salado, which the mayor of Salado thinks is hysterical, but they want to distance themselves. Their dates show, the same kind of thing our dates show, and they have some of the same tools, which is not a surprise because it's the same site. The area they were excavating is 300 yards downstream from that big hole. And we've excavated in the properties in between and show that the site continues down the valley. So that's what it is. What do we have planned for Gault in the future? Well, we're done excavating at Gault. We've excavated 3% of the site. We have 2.6 million artifacts. Statistically, if I dug more at Gault, I'd find more of the same. I mean, yes, there's always the chance that 5 feet over that way is the Great Jade Monkey Idol, but it's a very tiny statistical chance. And archaeology, while we always say it's about research questions, is actually often constricted by time, money, and personnel. And it is not a good use of my time, money, or personnel to do more at Gault. I need to find other sites like Gault. So that's why we spend a lot of time testing, particularly in Central Texas, trying to find something that would resemble that. Gault is our educational venue. We just erected a brand new sign out there that's incredible. You can see it on our Facebook page. It's 15 feet high and 24 feet long. So nobody can tell me they missed it ever again. But we're actually just got a grant for new signage out of Gault, some permanent signage for our trails. We're building another trail out there. We developed new programs for 2nd through 4th graders because we started getting calls for younger kids out there. We're hopefully, when the pandemic ceases to rear its ugly head, we can get some more people out there for member events and stuff like that. So we have things out of Gault all the time. We're currently taught humans originated in Africa. Do you think it's possible they could have originated here and migrated in the other direction? I would say it is very unlikely, mostly because we've never found an older hominid in the New World. And the paleontologists have been working a lot longer than the archaeologists. They've been looking for old bones for a long time. I won't say it's impossible, but it doesn't seem to fit any of the evidence we have. The evidence from the broad evidence from DNA, the evidence from linguistics, the evidence from sites we've found so far seems to all indicate that humans originated in Africa and spread out. There is a possibility that some of the later branches developed elsewhere outside of Africa. There's some stuff that may have developed in Asia, but we don't have enough information yet. What spatial analysis methods are employed interpreting spatial patterning at Gault? Well, everything, all the data at Gault is in a great big GIS system. So that's really the primary thing. And that GIS system encompasses all of the geophysics we've done, all of the point provenience archaeological pieces, all of the geology. We have LiDAR imagery, historical photographic imagery. So with the GIS system, we've actually had a number of hypotheses along the way that people said, oh, I thought it was like this. We had one area on the site where we thought that we had a fulsome occupation separated by about 8 to 10 centimeters from Clovis separation. There were 6 professional archaeologists that worked there. We all thought exactly the same thing. Then we ran the GIS analysis with all the point provenience artifacts and found, yeah, it really wasn't. That was just our perception. When you looked at where the actual artifacts were, there was pretty much a continual occupation right through. So no dead space in between them. How close do you think the water sources were to the Gault site 20,000 years ago? Well, they were right there. The stream's been there at least 20,000 years, probably more. There are lots and lots of springs there. The location of individual springs and the location of where Buttermilk Creek was in the valley might have differed a little bit over time, but the valley isn't that wide. So the water was right there. We counted 32 springs on our 80 acres. In a wet year, we have 6 that run even during the drought. So there was lots of water there in the past. There still is. And I have you found another site like Gault to work on in the future? I haven't found one just like Gault. I find occasionally Clovis sites. I haven't found the older than Clovis yet. We had one in our gun sites for a while that was 5 miles east of Gault on one of the next streams over that feeds into the Salado. It looked exactly like Gault. It had a number of springs and a valley with ridges on either side with chert on them. The valley floor was covered with artifacts. There were middens there. We did test that this summer in July, and we found that, well, the valley's a little too narrow, and it got pretty much washed out and scoured sometime in the more recent past, and the middens go right to bedrock. So the oldest stuff there was only about 8,000 to 9,000 years old. We weren't getting anything older. So we just keep looking. We tell people in our business, you got to kiss a lot of frogs. You know, you don't know that you have a buried intact context until you actually dig into it. And if you're looking at things that are 10 or 12 feet down, you got to dig a lot of holes, and you just keep digging them. We look at what people have collected over the years on their properties. We look at eroded features and everything to try and narrow down areas that might be likely. We're also looking at the geological and soil maps to look for old soils. But yeah, we just keep testing. I hope maybe this year it'll be my lucky year. How likely, in your opinion, are the dates of the Cerruti site in California will be correct and foresee a far older habitation? Oh boy. We have disagreements on our own staff about that. Two of our staff went out to see it. We all know the Hollands really well. They're good friends of ours. In fact, we're working on some projects with them. I hate to say this to their face. I personally think it's very unlikely. I think the dates are correct for the Mammoth. I think their evidence for humans is so slight that they need an awful lot more context. Steve Holland has spent a lot of time showing that humans can break mammoth bone in that fashion. He has not shown that that's the only way that bone can break that way. And I think that's the thing that really is holding us up, because he's arguing that his evidence is these bones are broken a certain way and people are probably using these as tools, but the only evidence he has are the breakage patterns. So yeah, I think there's a lot more work needs to be done on that. And since, as I said, paleontologists and other people looking have not found earlier humans or hominids in the New World, it's unlikely, but like any archaeologist, I can't say, nope. Tomorrow they could find a site that proves me completely and utterly wrong, and I'd be happy to see that. It would be another major step in understanding the science. Any other questions? That's all the ones I had queued up here. No? Well then, Mike, I'm done.
Excuse me. Thank you, Clark. And thanks to everybody who participated. We're kind of growing our outreach, growing our participation, which is always good for groups like us and Houston as well. We're looking forward to furthering our collaboration with Houston. Looking forward to hear Doug Crook and his presentation on Thursday evening, and our future presentations as well. We'll be posting our future meetings here as we get them lined up on our website. So Linda, we've got a minute or two if you want to add anything.
Just welcome Thursday night. We open our meeting at 6:30 for social, for a little social 30 minutes. We'll have a short business meeting, which will include approving our budget, but it's going to be very, very short. And then we'll launch into Doug Crook, whose program is going to be on the anthropology of hunting. And if you've never heard Doug Crook talk, he is a fabulous presenter, just like Clark. Maybe he learned everything he knows from Clark. I'm not sure. But it'll be a great meeting, and we welcome all of you to come.
I'm going to say that Dub predates me, so.
And I predate Dub. How exciting is that?
Okay, well, we're gonna adjourn. Thanks again, everybody. Thanks again for joining us. We're looking forward to many more like this, and hopefully eventually later on this year, maybe actually getting to all be in the same room. So we hope that happens. So we will keep everybody posted. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Paul, thank you. Thank you especially, Paul.
You're most welcome. I'll leave it up if anybody wants to talk.
Thanks, Paul. That was a great job.
And thanks for Mike and Clark.
And Mike, pursuant to our conversation the other day, I'm emailing you Cyprian's email.
Okay. Okay.
If you're interested in getting him to talk, I mean, tell him Clark sent you.
Yeah, I was personally interested with just that, knowing a fair amount of the early migrations into Mesoamerica.
He's a good speaker, and his stuff at Chiquihuite Cave, he drafted just about everybody who was anybody who knew, you know, how to do one of these sciences. And they dug that thing in clean suits, and oh man, it was amazing.
Okay. And so he's still, they still got dating prior to 25,000?
Yeah,
Really? Really?
yeah. And you know, and it was in Nature, and it was peer reviewed too. And
Yeah.
I imagine he got hammered on that,
Yeah.
you know, and they said, how could you prove that? And he did a really good job of showing how they could prove it. There's some people who are still arguing about the tools.
Yeah.
Old school is really lithics oriented, so we are really arguing. We've seen much worse than that, and those seem to be pretty decent tools.
Yeah.
We did the lithic analysis for both Monteverde and Huaca Prieta in Peru
Yeah.
in our lab. So
What are the earlier dates that they've got at Monteverde now?
well, there's one that's a little over 18.
Right. Okay.
The evidence for that to me seems pretty good.
Okay.
But, you know, the guys who went first to look at it really didn't want to even talk about that. And there are dates for another strata that's about 30,000 years old that even Tom Delahaye doesn't like talking about.
I bet.
He just, you know, the evidence is so sparse. So he's stuck with the strata he had the most evidence for.
You talk about slings and arrows. Delahaye has decades of scars to prove that.
He doesn't like talking at conventions. He doesn't go to the SAAs usually. He like Jim Adovasio. Jim Adovasio went back to his love, which is fibers and baskets. And he doesn't like talking about Metacroft at all, and hasn't written it up scientifically, which we keep nagging him on, but he's retired. I doubt he's going to do it.
Yeah.
It's going to be written up by somebody else. He's just like, the hell with it. I'm not going to do it.
Well, we are certainly looking forward to all of your crews, articles and monograph, etc. It's going to be great.
Yeah, we've had lots of uninterrupted writing time. So this next year, next year and a half, probably, you'll probably see a lot more articles out of us.
Good.
Clark,
Yeah.
how does the Topper site figure into all this?
Topper's got really, really good Clovis evidence. Its evidence for older than Clovis is not very good. Again, Al Goodyear has been a good friend of Mike Collins for many, many years. When he first came out with this stuff, Mike actually sent him a group of rocks here from Central Texas to show him what starch fractures and other things look like, naturally fracturing rock. And, you know, I've talked to Al. Al is the nicest guy in the world. And you may have noticed if you look at his more recent stuff, he doesn't talk about older than Clovis anymore either. He talks about the Clovis episodes they had there, which were really good.
Yeah.
I think he's a little tired of it too. But like I said, it may be an older than Clovis site. It's just that the evidence he has is so slight that you need more.
Yeah.
You know, we say you need pretty much unassailable geological evidence, really good dating, and really good evidence for human occupation.
Yeah.
And unless you've got all three of those, and like I said, with Steve Holland stuff at Cerruti, you don't have all of those. You got really good dating. The geology is so. Keep in mind that the Cerruti Mammoth had already been dug up and was sitting on a museum shelf. So they're going back to recreate the geology of it. And then the human evidence is slight.
Yeah.
So, you need more context. You got to have all three.
Is the Florida site, Paige Langdon,
Yeah.
is that pretty solid?
Ladson is pretty good. Yeah. In fact, Andy Hemmings, who did a lot of the work there,
Yeah,
was on
okay.
our staff for many years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Paige
that
Ladson's got really good evidence. Yeah.
That was really interesting with all the, basically all underwater archaeology.
Yeah. The stuff they were doing along the Oscilla, the
Yeah.
interesting is just for Clovis, we got an awful lot of organic stuff. And Andy's dissertation actually surmised, and I agree with it, that, for instance, in Clovis culture, they may have used more bone points than stone points. But we don't see the evidence anymore because that stuff disappears unless it's been dry the whole time or wet the whole time.
Yeah.
But in our experiments, the bone points are a hell of a lot better than stone points. They have some flexibility so they don't break on impact.
Yeah.
And because they have a narrower area, if you're using like these metatarsals that we see and stuff, they penetrate really deeply. If you look at what Mike Waters wrote about the Manus mastodon, you've got a bone point that came down from above and went into the spine on a mammoth. I mean, you think about how much velocity that needs to do that and how sharp that thing's got to do to get in there like that. They're really good points.
Okay. Anybody else?
One last question, Clark. Are you familiar with what the final genetics were for the Wendover bog?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. There's, now Wendover, you gotta imagine, first of all, is early archaic. It's not Paleo-Indian. But the really neat thing about Wendover is that people were burying their dead for over 1,000 years in basically the same place. And when burying, they're actually rolling them up in shrouds and staking them out in a pond. And so you even have brain matter that they were able to recover. Stuff that's been preserved in this, now it's a bog. And the really neat part is the hypothesis had long been that you have these isolated groups along the coasts and they don't move around a lot and they probably don't interact a lot. Well, the DNA shows us what we really always knew, that it's not a good idea to marry your sister, and they're interacting a lot, right? Young people have to meet each other somehow. Groups fall apart, new groups form, things like that. And that the people at Wendover have affinities all the way up and down the East Coast. Now, these people, they knew a lot about who was around them, and they were moving around, at least in trade and information wise, a lot further than anyone expected. They were not an isolated small group on the coast,
Now, where's Wendover?
It's in Florida.
Oh, okay.
It was really the first large scale DNA thing they were able to do, because you had these bodies and parts of bodies. And like I said, because the shallow pond later became a bog, it preserved all kinds of things. There's a great big book about Wendover, and it changed a lot of our ideas on what we thought about this stuff. And then you get little changes like, S. Willerslav and his team at the Center for Ancient DNA in Copenhagen were, and as he tells it, they were sitting around drinking, and most good stuff in archaeology comes from drinking, I think, but sitting around drinking beer and bemoaning the fact that they couldn't get DNA from hair because there's too many contaminants. And one guy said, well, what if we just strip the outer sheath of it off? And they said, well, I don't know how you do that. And the guy went to the grocery store and bought Drano. They dipped some hair into it, and it strips the sheath from the outside of human hair really quickly, and they got 98% pure DNA. And one of the first tests they did of that was of hair they'd found in northern Greenland from the Sakak culture. Now, the Sakak culture is the earliest culture there, and we'd always assumed that those people became the Dorset and the Maritime Archaic and eventually the modern Inuit. Except we find that the Sakak culture isn't even remotely related to the Inuit. The only people related to them that still exist live in Siberia, and those people went all the way across to Greenland 4,500 years ago and either went back home or the culture died out. And then it was replaced by more recent immigrants from Siberia. So, there's these migrations that we can document now that happened repeatedly in the Americas. And it wasn't one way. We actually see fluted point technology go to Siberia 12,000 years ago the other direction.
Mhm.
And we always tell people, don't say this in front of the Canadians, since they use it as a symbol for everything, but the moose is Chinese. He walked in here coming this way. So there's animals coming in and people coming in and people going out, information traveling both directions. We always tend to think of this as a single event of a small group of people, planting a flag and say, I claim the North America in the name of Clovis. And it's not, it's a process. You have to have more than 100 people and ideally more than 1,000 people for a viable human population. So it's not one small group, it's multiple people over time coming into new territory. And as we see from Clovis, found from southern Canada all the way to Venezuela, they're interacting over a very large area. I mean, it's very doubtful that the people who are in Venezuela using Clovis technology spoke the same language as the people in southern Alberta.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big distance, but they're trading information over those distances. People are like, hey, that's cool. Some guy came up with this. It's the coolest looking thing I've ever seen. We should make our tools that way too.
Well, I'm going to have to jump off. You guys keep going. We got as long as you want, but we really, thanks again to everybody.
You are welcome.
Thank you.
See you soon. Thank you.
Anybody wish to continue or should we end it?
Anybody got any other questions?
I've got a question.
All right.
Is it possible, Clark, that you have recorded some other videos like this, maybe posted them on YouTube?
Yeah, Gault School has a YouTube channel.
Okay.
We're gradually putting some up there. We also help do a number of things for the Texas Archaeological Research Lab for Archaeology Month.
Right.
And if you look at the Taro blog, there's a whole series of talks there,
Okay. That's
including
great.
some by a couple of our members. Yeah.
Okay. How would you feel about us posting this presentation today as a YouTube?
I don't have a problem with it.
Okay. It's just something for us to talk over. It was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank
Hey,
you.
you guys are a good audience. I like dealing with the folks that I don't have to explain everything to.
Well, good. Thank you much. I'm going to take off. You have a good day.
See you guys. I'm going to end it.
All right. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.